somewhere beneath the surface of the oldest waters on Earth, before the first human hand ever pressed itself into wet clay, before the first fire was struck, before the first word was spoken aloud into the dark, something moved. It did not need to be seen. It did not need to be understood. It simply was, vast, patient, coiled in the deep like a thought too enormous for any one mind to contain. We would eventually give it a name. We called it the Leviathan. Take a moment, if you will, and sit with that word, Leviathan. Even the sound of it carries weight, a long, slow exhalation, like the ocean itself breathing out. It is not a word that rushes. It does not need to. Words that describe truly enormous things rarely do. The Leviathan is, without question, one of the oldest and most enduring creatures in all of human mythology. And yet, to call it merely a myth feels somehow insufficient. Dishonest even, because the Leviathan has never truly gone away. It has moved through human consciousness for thousands of years. From the earliest sacred texts ever committed to stone and papyrus, through the journals of trembling sailors in the open Atlantic, through the whispered stories of fishermen who came back from the sea with something missing from their eyes. Always there, always just beneath the surface. And tonight, we are going to go looking for it together. The Leviathan story begins, as so many of history's most important stories do, in the ancient Near East, specifically in the rich and turbulent mythological traditions of the civilizations that rose and fell along the banks of the Tigris and the Euphrates. Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, a land of extraordinary human invention and extraordinary human fear. It is here, in texts that predate the earliest books of the Bible by thousands of years, that we find the first shadows of what would become the Leviathan. The Babylonians spoke of Tiamat, a vast, dragon-like goddess of primordial chaos, a creature of salt water and darkness who existed before the world had form. In the Ugaritic texts, discovered only in the 20th century on the coast of modern-day Syria, we encounter Lotan, a writhing, seven-headed sea serpent struck down by the storm god Baal in a battle that shook the very foundations of the heavens. These are not separate creatures. They are the same terror, passing through different hands, translated into different languages, carrying the same ancient weight across the centuries. And then they arrived in the Hebrew Bible. In the book of Job, one of the oldest and most philosophically profound texts in all of Scripture, God himself turns to a suffering man and asks, with something that can only be described as quiet pride, "Can you draw out Leviathan with a fishhook?" It is a rhetorical question, of course. The answer is no. No one can. No army, no king, no god that humanity had ever fashioned with its own hands. The Leviathan, in that ancient telling, is presented not as a villain to be defeated, but as proof of something far more humbling, the sheer, incomprehensible scale of creation itself. Throughout this documentary, we are going to follow the Leviathan across time and across the world. We will sit with the scholars and theologians who have spent their lives decoding its earliest appearances in sacred literature, and we will listen carefully to what those ancient writers were truly trying to say when they reached for this image, this impossible world-dwarfing creature, to make their point. We will walk the harbors of medieval Europe and Scandinavia, where sailors returned from voyages with accounts of something in the water that defied every category available to them, something that surfaced slowly, like a continent rising, something that, when it dove back beneath the waves, created currents strong enough to pull entire ships down after it. We will examine what the Leviathan does, the kind of destruction that ancient and medieval writers attributed to it. And we will find, in those descriptions, something that speaks less to fantasy and more to a very real, very human understanding of what it means to be small. And we will ask, quietly and without rushing, the question that has followed this creature since the very beginning. What if something like this was real? And what if, in the deepest and most uncharted places left on this earth, something still is? The ocean covers more than 70% of our planet's surface, and we have explored, with any meaningful confidence, less than 20% of it. The rest is darkness. The rest is depth. The rest is waiting. Come with us. We are only just beginning. Part 2. What it was, and what it meant. Before we can truly understand what the Leviathan did, before we can stand at the edge of any harbor and imagine it rising, we must first understand what the Leviathan was. And that, as it turns out, is a far more complicated question than it first appears. Because the Leviathan was never just one thing, it was never just one creature, living in one sea, described by one people. It was, instead, something that humanity kept arriving at, independently, repeatedly, across thousands of years and thousands of miles of separation. Different languages, different gods, different coastlines, and yet the same essential terror surfacing again and again like something that refused to stay submerged. That is worth sitting with for a moment, when many cultures, with no contact between them, reach for the same image to describe the same feeling. The feeling of standing at the edge of something boundless and unknowable. That image is telling us something true about the human condition. The Leviathan tells us that we have always known, somewhere very deep, that the world is larger than we are. The Hebrew Leviathan. Chaos. Given form. Let us begin where the word itself begins. In the ancient Hebrew tradition, the name Leviathan derives from the Hebrew root Leviathan, which carries within it the sense of something coiled, something twisted, something wound around itself in great and patient loops. Some scholars connect it to a word meaning wreath or garland, but do not be misled by the gentleness of those images. This is not decorative coiling. This is the coiling of something immeasurably large that has not yet decided to move. The Leviathan appears in the Hebrew scriptures several times, and each appearance reveals a slightly different facet of the same overwhelming idea. In the book of Psalms, the creature is described almost tenderly, a great beast that God formed to play in the sea, the way a child might keep a pet. The ocean, in that vision, is the Leviathan's garden. Its movements are its pleasure. There is something almost peaceful in that image, until you let yourself fully consider its scale. A creature so vast that the entire ocean is its playground, that the tides themselves might be nothing more than the displacement of its slow, enormous breathing. In the book of Isaiah, the tone shifts entirely. Here, the Leviathan becomes something that God will one day destroy at the end of all things. The fleeing serpent, the twisting serpent, the dragon that is in the sea. 3 descriptions given in rapid succession, as though no single phrase is adequate. As though the writer reached for one image and found it insufficient, then reached again and again. The Leviathan in Isaiah is not a pet. It is the last great enemy. The final thing standing between creation and its completion. And then there is Job, magnificent, heartbroken Job, who sits in his suffering and demands answers from the universe. And God answers him, not with comfort, not with explanation, but with a catalogue of wonders, a long, extraordinary list of things beyond human comprehension or control. And at the very center of that list, the jewel of the argument, the ultimate proof of creation's incomprehensible scale, the Leviathan. Its breath sets coals ablaze, and flames dart from its mouth. Strength resides in its neck. Its chest is hard as rock, hard as a lower millstone. When it rises up, the mighty are terrified. The sword that reaches it has no effect. It makes the depths churn like a boiling cauldron and stirs up the sea like a pot of ointment. Read those words slowly. Let them settle. This is not a serpent. This is not a large fish. This is a force of nature wearing the shape of a living thing. This is chaos itself given scales and breath, and the terrible patience of deep water. Lotan, the seven-headed serpent of Ugarit. Now let us travel north and west along the ancient Levantine coast to the site of a ruined city called Ugarit in what is today northern Syria. In 1929, archaeologists digging through the remains of this Bronze Age civilization uncovered a collection of clay tablets that would rewrite everything scholars thought they knew about the origins of biblical mythology, written in a language called Ugaritic, a Semitic tongue closely related to ancient Hebrew. These tablets contained the stories of a people who worshipped a pantheon of gods. At the very same time, the earliest biblical traditions were taking shape. And in those stories, there is a creature called Lotan. Lotan is described in terms so similar to the Hebrew Leviathan that the connection is impossible to ignore. He is a great serpent. He is fleeing. He is twisting. He has 7 heads. And he is the enemy of the storm god Baal, who must descend to do battle with this ancient, writhing darkness in order to establish order over the world. The parallels to Isaiah's description of the Leviathan are not coincidental. Scholars now understand them to be part of the same deep current of mythological thought that flowed through the entire ancient Near East, a shared understanding that somewhere at the bottom of the primordial waters, chaos had taken a shape, and that shape was enormous and serpentine and had to be held in check by the greatest powers in the universe. What is remarkable about Lotan, and what sets him slightly apart from his Hebrew cousin, is those 7 heads. Because a 7-headed sea serpent is not a local invention. It appears in traditions from Mesopotamia to India to ancient Greece. 7 in the ancient world was the number of completion, of wholeness. A creature with 7 heads was not just powerful, it was complete in its power. It was chaos fully realized, every direction at once, every danger simultaneously. Tiamat, the mother of all monsters further east now, into Mesopotamia, into Babylon. Here, the equivalent of the Leviathan takes the form of Tiamat, and Tiamat is, in many ways, the most ancient of all these creatures. The Babylonian creation epic, the Enuma Elish, is one of the oldest written narratives in human history, and at its very heart is the story of Tiamat. Tiamat is the salt sea, not a creature in the sea. She is the sea. She is the primordial ocean from which all life emerged, depicted as a vast, dragon-like entity of immeasurable power. In the beginning of the Enuma Elish, she mingles with Apsu, the fresh water, and from that mingling the first gods are born. But Tiamat's children grow loud. They grow disruptive. They disturb her rest. And when Apsu decides to destroy them, and is himself destroyed by the younger gods in turn, Tiamat's grief transforms into something ancient and terrible. She raises an army of monsters, serpents, dragons, the Mushusu, a great horned dragon with the body of a serpent, the Basmu, a venomous snake of extraordinary size, creatures of the deep dark, woken and armed and sent against the world above. It takes the mightiest of the Babylonian gods, young Marduk, the storm god, the lord of wind, to face her. And when he finally does, he destroys her, not through raw power alone, but through cunning. He opens her mouth with the winds, fills her vast body with a storm, and splits her in 2. From her upper body, he forms the sky. From her lower body, the earth. Her eyes become the sources of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Her spittle becomes the clouds. The world, in this telling, is built from the body of a defeated sea monster. That is not a small idea. That is perhaps the largest idea a mythology can contain, that creation itself is an act of violence against primordial chaos, and that the world we live in is the remains of something vast and unknowable that was overcome, but never entirely erased. Jörmungandr, the world serpent of Norse tradition, cross now the cold centuries and travel north, further north than the ancient world had words for, into the ice-grey skies and iron-dark seas of Scandinavia. The Norse people were seafarers in a way that perhaps no other ancient culture quite matched. They lived with the ocean not as a backdrop, but as a constant companion, as provider, as road, as executioner. And so it is perhaps unsurprising that their version of the great sea serpent is, in many ways, the most physically staggering of all. They called it Jörmungandr, the Midgard serpent, the world's serpent. Jörmungandr was the offspring of the trickster god Loki and the giantess Angrboda, one of 3 catastrophic children born of that union, alongside the wolf Fenrir and the death goddess Hel. The All-Father Odin, knowing what these children would one day become, cast Jörmungandr into the ocean that surrounds all of the world. And there the serpent grew, and grew, and grew, until it had grown so large that it encircled the entirety of Midgard, the world of human beings, and could hold its own tail in its mouth. This is the image that has come down to us across the centuries. The Ouroboros, the serpent consuming itself, endless and encircling, the boundary between the known world and the void beyond. Jörmungandr and the thunder god, Thor, are destined enemies. In Norse mythology, Thor has already fished the serpent halfway from the ocean, hauled it toward the surface of the water with sheer strength before his companion cut the line in terror. The sea serpent sank back into the deep, and it will wait there, coiled around the world, until Ragnarok, the end of all things, when it will finally release its own tail, rise from the ocean, and walk onto the land. The oceans will flood the shores, the skies will darken, and Thor and Jörmungandr will meet for the last time, each the end of the other. There is something deeply affecting about the Norse conception of this creature. It is not simply a monster to be feared, it is a boundary. As long as it holds its tail in its mouth, the world holds its shape. The end of the Leviathan is the end of everything. Apep, the serpent of the Egyptian abyss. Egypt too knew this darkness. They called it Apep, or, in later Greek transliteration, Apophis. And Apep was perhaps the most purely terrifying of all these ancient sea serpents, because it did not live in the ocean. It lived in something deeper still. Apep inhabited Duat, the Egyptian underworld, the realm through which the sun god Ra had to travel each night in his solar bark, navigating the darkness beneath the world to rise again each morning on the eastern horizon. And every single night, without exception, Apep would attack. Every night was a battle for the continuation of reality. Apep was enormous. Descriptions in ancient texts give it a length of many hundreds of cubits, and it was the embodiment of chaos, of dissolution, of the unmaking of all things. It could not be killed. It could only be driven back. And so every night, Ra and his divine companions fought the same battle, and every morning that the sun rose was proof that they had won. Again, for now. What is profoundly interesting about Apep is its relationship to water. In Egyptian cosmology, the primordial state of the universe, before creation, was an infinite, dark, featureless ocean called Nun. Apep emerged from this primordial darkness. It was, in essence, what the universe had been before it became a place where anything could live. A vast, writhing reminder of what existence looked like before meaning was imposed upon it. The pattern beneath all patterns. And now, having traveled from the Levantine coast to Babylon, from the Norse north to the banks of the Nile, let us pause. Let us breathe, because what we have found in all of these traditions is not simply a collection of frightening stories about large creatures. What we have found is a pattern, a remarkably consistent, remarkably specific pattern. In every culture that developed near large bodies of water, in every tradition that grappled seriously with the question of what existed before the world had formed, in every mythology that tried to answer the question of what waits at the edge of the known, there is a serpent. There is something vast and coiling in the deep. There is a creature that is not simply dangerous, but is the source of danger itself. The original chaos. The thing that was there before order was imposed on the universe. The Hebrews called it Leviathan. The Ugaritians called it Lotan. The Babylonians called it Tiamat. The Norse called it Jemungandr. The Egyptians called it Apep. They are not all describing different creatures. They are all reaching in their own languages with their own symbols toward the same unreachable thing. They are all standing at the edge of the water, looking out at the horizon where the sky meets the sea, and feeling the same feeling. The feeling that has no clean name in any language, ancient or modern. The feeling that something is out there. Something that has always been out there. Something patient and vast and indifferent to everything you are. The feeling that you are very, very small, and that the deep water has no bottom. In our next segment, we will leave the sacred texts and the ancient myths behind us, and we will go looking for the Leviathan in the accounts of those who believed, with everything they had, that they had actually seen it. The sightings are waiting for us, and some of them are very hard to explain away. Part 3. Those who claimed to have seen it. There is a particular kind of person who goes to sea for a living. They are not, as a rule, given to fantasy. They are practical people, shaped by an environment that punishes carelessness and rewards clear thinking. They know weather. They know current. They know the difference between what the ocean actually is and what a frightened mind might make it into in the dark. These are people who have seen whales breach at close range and were not impressed. People who have watched storms build on the horizon and made calm, calculated decisions about whether to run or hold. When these people come back from the water and say they saw something they cannot explain, something large and wrong and unlike anything they had words for, it is worth listening carefully, because across the span of recorded maritime history, a great many of them did. The earliest recorded accounts, the oldest written accounts of sea creature encounters that bear any resemblance to the Leviathan tradition, come to us from the ancient Mediterranean. Greek sailors navigating the waters between islands spoke of creatures they called ketos, immense sea monsters that could shallow a ship, that surfaced slowly enough that the first sign of their presence was not a sight, but a sound, a deep displacement of water, a change in the quality of the silence around them. The historian Aristotle, writing in the 4th century BCE, is sometimes cited as an early skeptic of sea monster accounts, and he was in many respects. But even Aristotle acknowledged, in his writings on natural history, that the ocean contained creatures of extraordinary and poorly understood size. He was not dismissing the sailors. He was simply trying to find rational frameworks for what they were describing. Pliny the Elder, the great Roman naturalist who died in the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE, went considerably further. In his monumental work, Naturalis Historia, Pliny described a creature observed by soldiers stationed on the coast of Lisbon, a beast of such size that when its carcass washed ashore, local officials sent a formal report to Rome. He described sea serpents encountered by naval commanders in the Indian Ocean. He catalogued the accounts of fishermen along the African coast who described creatures that surfaced like islands and dove like storms. Pliny was not a man prone to credulity. He was a collector of evidence, and the evidence he collected from sources he considered credible pointed consistently towards something enormous in the deep water. The Norse sailors and the thing below. Perhaps no maritime culture produced more consistent or more detailed accounts of great sea creatures than the Norse. And this is not simply because they sailed more, though they did. It is because they recorded more. The Norse saga tradition placed enormous value on the precise, unembellished description of events. Exaggeration was not considered a virtue. What was witnessed was what was written, and what was written, across dozens of sagas and historical accounts from the 9th through the 13th centuries, included repeated encounters with something they called the Hafgufa. The Hafgufa appears in the Övar, Odd Saga, and in the remarkable medieval text known as the Konungs Skuggjar, the King's Mirror, a 13th century Norwegian educational work that attempted to describe all the natural wonders of the known world. The author of the King's Mirror, writing with the measured confidence of someone reporting established fact, describes the Hafgufa as the largest creature in the ocean. He says it resembles an island when at rest on the surface. He says that sailors who did not know what it was had anchored their ships to it, believing they had found land. He says it feeds by opening its vast mouth and releasing a belch of sweet-smelling vapor that draws fish into it in great numbers, then closes and swallows everything at once. What is striking about the King's Mirror account is its tone. The author is not trying to frighten his readers, he is informing them. He treats the Hafgufa the way a modern naturalist might treat an unusual but documented species. Something worth knowing about, worth being aware of, but not necessarily something to lose sleep over. It exists. Here is how it behaves. Here is how you might recognize it. That measured, factual tone is perhaps the most unsettling thing about it. Erik Pontoppidan and the Kraken. In 1752, a Norwegian bishop named Erik Ludvigsson Pontoppidan published the first volume of a work called The Natural History of Norway. Pontoppidan was a serious scholar, a man of the church and of science, and he was deeply interested in separating superstition from observed reality. He interviewed fishermen. He cross-referenced accounts. He was, in his way, conducting what we might today recognize as field research, and what his research consistently returned to was the creature the Norwegian fishermen called the Kraken. The accounts Pontoppidan collected were remarkably consistent across different fishermen from different regions who had no contact with one another. The Kraken, they said, was not always visible. Most often it was felt before it was seen. A sudden and inexplicable rising of the seafloor in otherwise deep water. Schools of fish would appear in extraordinary numbers above it, drawn to the warmth or the disturbance of its presence. Fishermen who found this knew, with immediate and cold certainty, that they needed to leave. Quickly, when the Kraken surfaced, and Pontoppidan's informants were clear that it did surface on occasion, they described something that defied easy categorization. Not simply a serpent, not simply a whale, something with a vast, rounded body, with appendages that spread across the water like the tentacles of an enormous crab or squid, with a surface that seemed to shift and move independently. One fisherman described the sensation of the water around his boat changing texture, becoming thick and different in some way he could not articulate, before the shape beneath him began, slowly, to rise. Pontoppidan, to his considerable credit, did not dismiss these accounts. He concluded that the Kraken was a real animal, almost certainly of a species unknown to formal science, and that its existence was as well attested as many creatures that naturalists accepted without question. He was, as it turned out, not entirely wrong. The giant squid, Architeuthis dux, was formally confirmed by science in the 19th century, a creature of truly staggering dimensions, capable of reaching lengths of over 12 meters, with eyes the size of dinner plates, a creature that the sailors of earlier centuries had been describing, in their own imprecise way, for a very long time. But the giant squid, extraordinary as it is, does not fully account for all of what those fishermen described. It does not account for the rising of the sea floor. It does not account for the accounts that describe something the size of a small island. The Daedalus encounter. On the 6th of August, 1848, the crew of the British Royal Navy vessel HMS Daedalus observed something in the South Atlantic that their commanding officer, Captain Peter Mackay, subsequently described in a formal report to the Admiralty. The creature was observed for approximately 20 minutes. It moved at a steady pace without any undulating vertical motion, meaning it was not propelling itself the way a swimming mammal would. It passed close enough to the ship that the crew could observe its head clearly. The head was held out of the water at a consistent height. The portion of its body visible above the water was estimated at 60 feet in length, with what appeared to be a mane of some kind along the back of its neck. Captain McQuay was not given to drama. His report is precise, professional, and deeply uncomfortable reading for anyone who wants to believe the ocean holds no surprises. He stated directly that the creature was not a whale, not a shark, not a seal, not any known species. He stated that he had been at sea for many years and was confident in that assessment. He provided a sketch. His crew corroborated every detail of his account. The report caused an immediate sensation in London. The zoologist, Sir Richard Owen, one of the most distinguished scientists of the Victorian era, publicly argued that McQuay had seen a large seal in an unusual position. Moorhigh responded with controlled but unmistakable irritation that he knew what a seal looked like. The debate was never resolved. The creature was never identified. These are not isolated incidents. They are points on a map that stretches across centuries and oceans and cultures that had no knowledge of one another, all of them marking the same location. Something is down there. Whether that something is the Leviathan of Scripture, the Hafgafur of the Norse sagas, the Kraken of Norwegian fishermen, or something that science has not yet found adequate language for. The pattern of human testimony is too consistent, too widespread, and too carefully reported to simply set aside. The water is very deep, and the witnesses were not all wrong. Next, we turn to something that requires us to set aside, for a moment, the question of what the Leviathan might be, and ask instead what it could do, because the accounts of its power, drawn from mythology and from history alike, describe a kind of destruction that has no equal in the natural world. That is where we are going next. Part 4. The weight of its wrath and the world it could unmake. The final segment. Everything we have explored together up to this point has been a form of preparation. The ancient texts, the mythologies, the trembling accounts of sailors who came back from the water changed. All of it has been leading us, quietly and deliberately, toward the question that has always lived at the center of the Leviathan story. The question that every culture, every writer, every frightened fisherman was circling without quite arriving at directly. What would it actually do? Not in the abstract, not in the language of poetry or scripture, but in the real, physical, measurable sense. If the Leviathan were real, if it rose tomorrow from whatever depth it has been keeping, what would the world look like afterward? To answer that responsibly, we must take the three most enduring, most widely believed versions of this creature, the ones that have persisted longest, traveled furthest, and taken the deepest root in human imagination, and we must sit with each of them honestly. We must take what we know of physics, of oceanography, of the natural world, and hold it against what these traditions describe. What we find is not comforting. The first, the biblical Leviathan. Of all the versions of this creature that have survived into the modern world, none has reached more people across more centuries than the Leviathan of the Hebrew Bible. Through Jewish scripture, through Christian theology, through the writings of Milton and Blake and countless others who built upon that foundation, the biblical Leviathan has become the Leviathan most people mean when they say the word at all. And the biblical tradition is, in its descriptions of this creature's power, extraordinarily specific. It breathes fire. Its hide cannot be pierced by iron, by bronze, by any weapon fashioned by human hands. Its chest, the book of Job tells us, is as hard as the lower millstone, a surface against which grain was ground to powder. It makes the deep churn like a boiling cauldron. When it moves through the water, it leaves a luminous wake, a shining path on the surface of the sea, so that the deep itself appears to be white-haired with its passing. Now set that description against what we understand of the physical world. A creature of this scale, one large enough to make the ocean itself boil in its wake, would displace water in quantities that beggar reasonable imagination. A whale, which is among the largest animals in documented natural history, creates measurable wave disturbances when it surfaces. The Leviathan of Job is described in terms that suggest a scale perhaps 10, perhaps 50 times greater. A creature of that mass surfacing rapidly from deep water would produce displacement waves, effectively tsunamis, radiating outward in every direction from the point of emergence. Those waves, depending on the depth from which the creature rose and the speed of its ascent, would reach coastal areas in a matter of hours. A wave generated by that kind of displacement, striking a coastline, would not arrive as a wall of water. It would arrive as a withdrawal first, the ocean pulling back from the shore, drawing back further than any tide, exposing the seafloor. And then it would return. That is before we consider the fire. The book of Job does not describe the Leviathan's fire as metaphor. It is described with the same matter-of-fact specificity as its scales and its wake. Flames dart from its mouth. Its breath sets coals ablaze. If we take that literally, and the ancient writers intended it literally, we are describing a creature capable of projecting ignited material across open water. In a world of wooden ships and coastal settlements, built almost entirely of timber and thatch, the implications are absolute. There would be no defense. There would be no harbor deep enough or fleet large enough to offer any meaningful resistance. The biblical Leviathan, taken at its word, is not a predator in any conventional sense. It does not hunt. It does not pursue. It simply moves through the world, and the world is diminished by its passing. The second, Jörmungandr, the world serpent. The Norse Jörmungandr presents a different kind of destruction entirely, where the biblical Leviathan is a force of localized, if catastrophic, physical devastation. Jörmungandr's power is systemic. It is architectural. It is not a creature that damages the world. It is a creature whose movement changes the structure of the world itself. This requires a moment of explanation. In Norse cosmology, Jörmungandr does not simply live in the ocean. It encircles the world. Its body, coiled in the deep water at the edges of Midgard, is in a very real sense one of the things that holds the world in its current shape. The serpent is not just a resident of the ocean. It is, in some fundamental way, the boundary between ordered existence and the formless void beyond. When Jörmungandr releases its tail, the act that in Norse mythology signals the beginning of Ragnarok, the cosmological consequences are immediate and total. The Norse texts are specific about what happens next. The seas surge over the land, not in the form of a wave, but in the form of a fundamental change in the relationship between water and earth. The ocean does not crash ashore. The ocean reclaims the land, the way a tide reclaims sand, except permanently and completely. What the Norse were describing in their mythological language is something that modern geology has a name for. When a body of water of sufficient size and depth undergoes a rapid and violent change in its basin, whether through tectonic activity or the sudden removal of a boundary that was containing it, the result is what scientists call a megaflood event. The water does not wave. It does not surge. It moves like a slow, irresistible wall. covering everything beneath a depth that no structure, no high ground, no refuge could meaningfully address. But Jörmungandr's destruction goes beyond the physical. The Norse texts tell us that when the world serpent rises, it poisons the sky. Its venom, which it has been accumulating since the beginning of time, which it drips constantly into the ocean beneath it, is released into the air during its final emergence. The atmosphere itself becomes toxic. The sun darkens not because it is blocked, but because what reaches it through the poisoned air is no longer what it was. If we set Jörmungandr against our understanding of what a creature of world-encircling scale would actually represent, a biomass so vast that it constitutes a significant portion of the ocean's total mass, then its venom is not a metaphor. It is the chemical consequence of that much biological material, decomposing, releasing, changing. The ocean's chemistry would shift. The atmosphere above it would shift with it. Jörmungandr does not destroy the world. It ends the conditions under which the world as we know it is possible. That is a quieter kind of apocalypse in some ways. And in some ways, it is far more frightening. The third, Tiamat, the ocean that remembers. Chaos Tiamat is the oldest of our three. Older than the Hebrew scriptures, older than the Norse sagas, and her power is, in the most fundamental sense, the most total of all. Because Tiamat's destruction is not the destruction of the world, it is the destruction of meaning. The Babylonians understood creation as an act of imposition. The gods had taken primordial chaos, vast, formless, dark, and imposed upon it the structures that made existence intelligible. Day and night, sea and sky, above and below. These were not natural states. They were achievements. They were things that had been fought for at enormous cost against an opponent of limitless power. Tiamat, in her defeated state, became the world. Her body became its structure, but the Babylonian tradition was deeply aware, in a way that perhaps no other ancient mythology quite matches, that this arrangement was not permanent, that the chaos had not been destroyed. It had been organized, and what is organized can, under sufficient pressure, become disorganized again. If Tiamat were to wake, if the primordial chaos from which the world was constructed were to reassert itself, the destruction would not take the form of fire, or flood, or poison. It would take the form of dissolution. The boundaries between things would begin to fail, not dramatically, not all at once, slowly, the way a sandcastle fails at high tide, not collapsing, but simply becoming, degree by degree, less castle and more sand. The predictive damage of a truly awakened Tiamat, by the internal logic of the civilization that created her, is absolute, not because she would burn or flood or poison the world, but because she is what existed before the world had a shape that could be burned or flooded or poisoned. Her awakening is not an event within history. It is the end of history's ability to occur at all. The closing of deep waters. Three creatures, three traditions, three very different answers to the question of what the Leviathan could do. One would leave the world physically devastated, coastlines gone, cities burned, the ocean scarred with the luminous wake of something that passed through and could not be stopped. One would leave the world chemically and structurally changed. The seas over the land, the sky above the seas darkened, the conditions for familiar life quietly and completely dissolved. One would leave the world conceptually unmade, not destroyed, but return to a state in which destruction and creation are not yet different things. And yet, for all their differences, these three traditions share something. Something that is perhaps the most important thing the Leviathan, in all its forms, has ever tried to tell us. None of them describe something evil. That is the detail that gets lost sometimes in the drama of scales and fire and flood. The Leviathan is not malicious. Tiamat is not wicked. Jomunganda does not hate. The biblical Leviathan, that crown jewel of God's creation held up as proof of the universe's incomprehensible scale, is simply itself. It exists, it moves, it breathes, and the world reorganizes around those facts, whether it wishes to or not. There is something almost clarifying about that, because the Leviathan, ultimately, is not a story about a monster. It is a story about scale. It is every civilization that ever stood at the edge of dark water and understood, wordlessly and completely, that the universe does not require their permission to be vast, that the deep places are deep, regardless of whether anyone descends to measure them, that there are forces in the world so large that they are not, in any meaningful sense, in relationship with human beings at all. They simply exist, in the way that gravity exists, in the way that time exists, patient and enormous, and entirely indifferent to the small, warm, wandering creatures standing at the shore. We built the Leviathan because we needed a shape for that feeling, and we have never stopped needing it. The ocean is quiet now. The harbor lights reflect in long, trembling lines across the surface of the water. Somewhere out beyond the breakwater, beyond the reach of any light we have made, the dark water deepens, and deepens, and deepens still. We do not know what is down there. We have never fully known. Perhaps that is the point. Perhaps the Leviathan was never meant to be caught. Perhaps it was only ever meant to be remembered, carried in the back of the human mind like a stone, carried in a deep pocket, a small, steady weight reminding us, whenever we grow too certain of our own significance, that the world is older than we are, that the deep water has been there longer, that something coils, patient and enormous, at the bottom of every ocean we have ever looked out across and failed to see the far shore of.